So on the next slide, what we're looking at here, this is really important because we're looking here at something that are called, that come to be called. We might, in the old days, we probably would have called them spring puddles, but they're now come to be called vernal pools. And they're places where water accumulates and stands in the spring in dry areas. And they, because this is so rare in these very arid areas, they tend to turn into this quick bloom of really exotic plants. They've been identified as some of the highest concentrations of rare and endangered species in North America, the vernal pools in California. And the Nature Conservancy bought a ranch with a bunch of vernal pools on it and hired a scientist there to chronicle what they were going to do to preserve these pools. The first thing they did is they said, well, we've got to get the cattle off. It had been a ranch. It had grazing animals on it, grazing cattle. And the scientists that they hired said, well, wait a minute, you like this place the way it is. It says, oh, my God, it's one of the most fabulous concentrations of these really rare habitats anywhere on the planet. Of course, we love it. And she says, well, are you sure you want to change it? And they said, oh, yeah, cows, they wreck things. We got to get them off of here. So they removed the cattle, and they found out that the vernal pools started to do what has happened to this one on the left. They started to be invaded by the same sort of exotics that invaded those enclosures on the last preserve, illustrated in the last slide. And the rare animals and the rare plants, fairy shrimp, that sort of thing, they started to disappear. And so they came to their senses, and they said, and they also noticed that on fence lines with their neighbors who still graze cattle, the vernal pools on the cattle pastures were still doing fine. So they restored cattle. I actually know the rancher they hired to bring cattle back onto their land and put the cattle back in the vernal pools, and they recovered. They came back to life. They held water because of the hooves pressing the clay into the cracks that would have let it dry up, and the cattle ate the exotics so that they couldn't succeed, and the native plants once again were revived, and now that ranch and those pools are doing well, doing fine. This is another interesting situation because this has to do with riparian areas. This is the Verde River, not too far from where I live right now. I'm on a tributary of the Verde, and this is a ride that we took down on one of the ranches I work with in this area to see what had happened to a threatened fish. A couple of environmental groups had sued to have cattle removed from along this river because they deemed the cattle and the grazing and the effects of their grazing to be a danger to the fish. And so they threatened to sue the Forest Service, and the Forest Service sort of was intimidated by the whole process, and it ordered the ranchers along the Verde to remove their cattle in order to protect this fish. And the Verde has historically been a collection of sedge meadows like the one you see here. This is one of the ones that survived along the Verde until quite recently. And while the river was a collection, a string of these sedge meadows, an emerald necklace, if you will, an emerald course, an emerald staircase, that's what I called it. When the river was an emerald staircase of these kinds of sedge meadows, the fish had thrived there, and it had thrived there for 100 years in coexistence with cattle grazing along it, and before that with elk grazing along it and antelope grazing and heavy here again I'm working with the scientist Al Medina, and Medina had pointed out, he said, well, before there were cattle here, when there were large herds of elk and other animals, even bison at one time, where did they all hang out? Well, they hung out down here and they grazed these sedge meadows, and the sedge meadows coexisted with that, and so did the spike dace in the river. But when they removed cattle from the river, you can see it happening here. If you notice off to the right near the grass that's tan, you'll see some small trees that have just sprouted in here, and they sprouted since cattle grazing has been reduced and the impacts along the river have been reduced. And as the trees sprouted, they caused turbulence in the river, which caused the river to swirl and erode and start to remove and wash away the sedge meadows and the turf that they had built up over time. Here you can see that just beginning to happen. You can see some of the deposits from some of the floods up in the trees. And here you can see the result of that. This once had been a sedge meadow too, but when the trees invaded it, and they've done soil trenches along there and haven't found any wood to denote that this river had ever had trees, large trees along it. It had been mostly just a string of those sedge meadows. And here the sedge meadow is gone. It's gone from almost all of the river. And over time, once the trees have moved into the sedge meadows and caused the turbulence and caused the water to start to erode the sods, it actually washes the meadow away and washes it down to rock and sand and gravel. And what had once been lush, remember the photo of the fellows riding horseback through one of these meadows, now has become something that looks very much like a desert. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is if you go down, a riparian area that had been 100 or more feet wide is now reduced to a matter of inches, just right along the stream where there are trees growing, and back from that you have something that looks like the Sahara Desert. And it's really curious to me as an environmentalist how many people and organizations within the environmental movement demand that cattle be removed from along riparian areas to save them. Well, it surely didn't save this one. But there is one place along the Verde where the sedge meadows have been able to persist. This is some lands right near the headquarters of the Rio Verde Ranch, on the Verde River, of course, that is grazed heavily every year. When this fellow, Dave Geip, the rancher, puts his cattle in here to sustain them during dry times, they graze this down. They graze it. If you saw it, in fact, scientists have seen it and say it's overgrazed. But yet, when it comes back. This is fairly early in the growing season. You could come here at other times of the year. In fact, I've got another photo on in the slideshow that shows this with grass up around our waist. Sometimes it gets up as high as your neck in here, as it recovers every year, as it's been doing for a long time. Now, other places along the river where we don't have these animals sustaining the sedge meadows, we've got cut banks that are almost 20 feet high. And as Al Medina has pointed out, what we've done is in those areas we've eroded the Verde back to the Pleistocene. Because we've taken it back, you can tell by doing soil trenches and by looking at the profiles of the soil that we've taken it back beyond human habitation. All the soil that's been put there for the last several thousand years is now in dams down by Phoenix. And the other curious thing is what happened to the fish. Well, the fish that this move was done in order to protect, to preserve, to sustain, has disappeared with the sedge meadows. It's gone. There aren't any there anymore. They've been trying since 1996 to find a spike dace in the river. That's when the preservation of the river and the removal of cattle was completed. And they haven't seen a spike dace since. But yet they won't change their practice and try to resume what had been happening here that the spike dace had coexisted with for a century and more. The plan now is to poison the entire river and kill every living thing in it, and then to bring some spike dace in from some other place and turn them loose. But we're all fairly confident that now that the river's changed, so there's no longer spike dace habitat, they'll just die too. There's the last in this series. It's one of my favorite slides. I love to show this to people. On the left, what you have is some land being restored under lawsuit by environmental groups. This is land in the Ojai Valley in California. I took this slide about 4 years ago. That would be about 2004, somewhere around in there too, maybe 2006. And they're drip irrigating it. They've seeded it. They're irrigating this land to try to restore it to native grassland because that's what the lawsuits have mandated. And at some point in the not-too-distant future, if they don't succeed, LA is going to have to pay a hefty fine every day for not succeeding in restoring this land. We talked to the department in charge of this, and they said they've got their best minds working on it, and this is what they have been able to achieve. You can see some little sprouts of green. This is 2 years into the restoration when I took this, and you can see little sprouts of green at the places along these irrigation tubes where there are drip ports where water drips out of the tubing. But on the right side of the photo, you see another restoration. This is cropland on the left side, cropland on the right too, that looked just about as bad as the land on the left at one point after a huge flood, and it has been restored using animals, cattle. This is a ranch in New Mexico, managed by David Ogilvy, and this is, I like to put this up in slideshows that I show to environmental groups and ask them, which one do you want? Because so far as we know, we offered to restore the land on the left using cattle, me and a couple of people that I work with, and Los Angeles originally jumped at the offer, but then something went awry. I haven't been back to visit this land, but I've made calls and I've been told that it looks pretty much like it did when I was there.